A white widow shelters the Apache warrior who killed her husband. What happens next will break and heal you.
The year was 1872, and the wind across the Arizona territory didn't sing, it scraped. Dry and ragged, it cut through the canyons, carrying dust, ghost stories, and gunpowder with it. Ash Ridge sat hunched at the base of 3 broken hills, where the land bled rust and shadows stretched long even at noon. Folks said the soil there had soaked up too much blood to ever grow anything worth keeping. Maybe they were right. The town had a church, a saloon, and one jail cell with a rusted hinge that screamed every time it opened. It also had Margaret Colton, though no one called her that anymore. They just said the widow in low voices, sometimes with pity, sometimes with spite. She wasn't old, not yet. 32. But her eyes held the weight of someone who had already survived 2 lifetimes, one as the sheriff's wife, the other as the woman left standing after he never came back from a patrol east of the pass. Wes Colton had been shot in the back. They found him slumped over near an abandoned mining trail, one boot missing, badge still pinned to his chest. The town whispered it was the Apache. Margaret never believed that, not fully. Wes had enemies on both sides of the border, and not all of them wore feathers. After he died, the town changed toward her. Some men tipped their hats too slowly. Some women crossed the street instead of speaking. The preacher stopped asking her to Sunday dinner. As if her husband's blood stained her, too. Still, she stayed. She had land, the house Wes built with his own hands, and the stubbornness to tend to it alone. She wore a revolver on her hip and a tight braid down her back. Didn't smile much. Didn't need to. She had the garden, 2 mules, and her dog Boone. Enough. But the night it started, the wind carried something different. It was early spring, the moon still rising low and yellow like an old bruise. Margaret had gone out to check the fence near the east field. Boone had caught a scent, ears up, stiff as timber. Then she saw it, a trail of blood in the dirt, leading toward the dry creek bed. She followed slowly, hand resting on the revolver, heart beating with that quiet rhythm you learn after enough nights alone. What she found wasn't a cougar or a dying coyote. It was a man. Half in the shadows, half in moonlight, slumped beneath a cluster of rocks. Blood soaked his leg, but his eyes, sharp and dark, locked onto hers the second she came close. He didn't speak. Just watched her, chest rising slow, like every breath was a choice. He was Apache. Everything in Margaret's body told her to back away. Turn around. Let the wind and night take him. He might be a killer. Might have been part of the group blamed for Wes's death. Might have come here for more. But something in his face wasn't made of war. It was made of pain. Of hunger. Of a kind of silence that didn't threaten, it endured. Margaret didn't speak either. Just nodded, then disappeared for a moment. When she returned, she brought a canteen, a roll of cloth, and her father's hunting knife. She knelt, slowly. The man didn't flinch when she touched his leg, but his jaw tightened. The wound was deep, likely a bullet. She worked quickly, slicing the fabric of his trousers, cleaning with water, pressing cloth into the bleeding muscle. He watched her with that same unreadable stare, unmoving except for the shallow rise of his ribs. When she was done, she sat back, offered him the canteen. He drank, then handed it back without a word. She stood. Pointed north, toward the hills. "You can't stay here," she said quietly. "If they find you." She didn't finish. He gave a faint nod. He understood. She turned, Boone at her heel, and walked back through the cold silence, pretending the pounding in her chest wasn't fear, but something heavier. The next day passed like any other. She gathered eggs, tended the soil, patched the roof. But her ears stayed tuned to the wind. No riders. No shots. No smoke. That night, he was gone. But the day after that, when she opened the barn, she found something strange, her broken shovel, fixed and resting against the wall. No note. No tracks. Just that. The following week, she saw him again, only for a moment. She was hanging laundry and caught a figure near the tree line, watching. She didn't wave. Didn't run. Just nodded. He nodded back. Then vanished. Spring gave way to early summer. The desert turned hot and hard. Storms gathered over the distant peaks like bruises. Margaret didn't speak of him to anyone. She didn't need to. Once, a group of townsmen rode out searching for someone, a savage, they called him, said a ranch hand had seen a shadow near his cattle. Margaret kept her face blank, even as the sweat on her neck turned cold. They didn't find anything. But that night, she left a piece of cornbread near the old well. It was gone by morning. She didn't know his name. Didn't ask. He never crossed her threshold. But she started to leave things, a shirt she'd sewn, a strip of bandage, a pouch of tobacco. Sometimes, something appeared in return, a carved feather, wild berries, a handmade arrow. Once, a tiny bundle of sage tied with leather. She kept that one on her windowsill. They never touched. Never spoke again. But a rhythm settled between them, part fear, part comfort. Like two ghosts haunting the same piece of land, watching, remembering, maybe even hoping. Then one day, he was gone. For good. She waited. A week. A month. Through the changing wind and the yellowing sky of fall. Nothing. Until the winter she turned 62. When a rider came up the road just before dusk, cloaked in dust and time. He dismounted slow, as if the earth hurt him. She was tending the fire when Boone, older now, slower, let out a low whine. She opened the door. And there he stood. Older, leaner. Scars on his hands. The same dark eyes. In his palm, worn soft from time, was a silver locket. Hers. The one she'd lost 30 years ago. Ash Ridge didn't like quiet women, especially ones who didn't know their place. After Wes died, Margaret Colton learned that firsthand. At first, folks brought pies and casseroles, offered tight-lipped condolences, muttered prayers. But kindness doesn't hold long in dry country. It dries up like everything else. People grew cold. Curious. Suspicious. A woman alone wasn't supposed to hold land. She sure as hell wasn't supposed to hold her own without leaning on a man. She worked harder after that. Fenced the south pasture herself. Learned to shoot tighter. When the well cracked, she lowered herself down and fixed it with rope and grit. The harder she worked, the more they resented her. Then came the rumors. It started small, a shadow near the old spring, hoofprints that didn't match any settler's horse, food missing from the church's shed. Most blamed outlaws. A few whispered Apache. And in towns like Ash Ridge, that word was never said without fire behind it. One morning, after Sunday service, Margaret walked into the general store. The room went quiet. Not silent, but heavy. Silas Greaves, the owner, leaned across the counter. "You're the marshals calling for volunteers?" he asked, not looking her in the eye. "Claims someone's been prowling near the northern ridgeline. Says we oughta root out whoever's been leeching off good folk." Margaret didn't flinch. "You volunteering, Silas?" He gave a thin smile. "I'm just a storekeep. But the younger boys are eager." Behind her, boots shuffled. She knew those boots. Thomas Yates. Built like a barrel with a brain full of kerosene. Drank too much. Laughed too loud. Once tried to pull her into a dance and ended up with a black eye. Now he spoke low, like a snake coiled behind her shoulder. Funny thing, widow, heard someone spotted tracks near your fence line. She turned. Plenty of coyotes out there. He smirked. These wore boots. Margaret didn't answer. She simply took her coffee and left. But she felt the heat of their eyes on her back like sunlight on gunmetal. That night, she sat on her porch, shotgun resting across her lap. Boone lay at her feet, ears twitching. She didn't sleep. Not because of fear. Not even because of guilt. But because of what she knew, the desert didn't forget a kindness, and neither did hate. 3 days later, a fire started near the Miller property. The flames reached skyward like claws. Folks panicked, ran for water, beat at the earth with rags. In the chaos, Margaret noticed something. Thomas Yates wasn't helping. He was writing. Hard. North. Toward her land. She didn't wait. Mounting her mule, she rode fast, heart pounding like a war drum. Dust cut her lungs, wind sliced her face, but she kept going. By the time she reached the clearing near the dry creek bed, the sun was bleeding into the hills. And there, barely visible, was the man she hadn't seen in months. He was walking. Limping. His shoulder wrapped in cloth. Behind him, a trail of broken brush. In front of him, Thomas Yates, rifle raised. It all happened too fast. Thomas yelled something, but Margaret didn't hear it. She only saw the shot, heard the crack split the sky like thunder, and acted. Her own rifle kicked in her hands. The bullet didn't hit Thomas, but it hit close enough that he dropped to the dirt, cursing. The Apache warrior turned, face unreadable, blood soaking the side of his tunic. Margaret slid off her mule and stood between them. "He ain't hurting anyone," she said. Thomas scrambled to his feet. "You gone mad? That man's a fugitive. There's a bounty. He saved my life once. You think anyone in this town gives a damn? You think they'll believe you?" Margaret didn't blink. "Let them try." He stared at her. Then at the man behind her. Then back again. "You want to die for him?" Thomas asked. She shook her head. "No. But I'll live for what's right." That was the end of it, for the moment. Thomas rode off, shouting threats that trailed behind him like smoke. She helped the warrior onto the mule, took him back to the cabin at the far edge of her property, deep in the cottonwoods where no trail reached. She cleaned his wound. Boiled water. Sewed the torn skin with fingers steady from years of mending fence and burying grief. Still, they didn't speak. Not that night. Not the next. But something passed between them. Not just gratitude. Something heavier. Older. On the third day, as he sat in the doorway of the cabin, sunlight warming his face, he finally said something. "My name is Tov." She didn't ask what it meant. Just nodded. "Margaret." Tov looked at her a long moment. "I know." A silence settled again. Comfortable, almost. But Margaret knew it wouldn't last. The fire had drawn attention. Smoke didn't stay hidden in a town like Ash Ridge. Someone would come looking. Maybe not today. But soon. The next evening, she handed Tov a bundle. Inside, dried meat, water, a compass, and her father's old pocket knife. "You need to go," she said. Tav didn't move. Just studied her, eyes unreadable. You stay, they'll hang you, she said. You leave, maybe you live. Finally, he stood. Not quickly. Like someone lifting a memory too heavy to carry. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in buckskin. A locket. Her locket. She blinked, surprised. Where did you? He pressed it into her hand. You dropped it. Years ago. She opened it. Inside, a tiny, faded photo of Wes. And on the other side, her. She looked up. I'll come back, he said. She didn't ask when. Or why. Or if he meant it. He walked into the trees, swallowed by shadow. That night, Margaret sat alone on her porch. The town might hate her. The law might curse her. But for the first time in years, her heart felt like it was beating for something worth the pain. And the wind that scraped across Ash Ridge carried something different. Not just dust, but the weight of a choice. And maybe, just maybe, a promise.
The days that followed moved like water under ice, quiet on the surface, but shifting underneath. No one in Ash Ridge said Margaret's name out loud anymore. When she entered a room, conversations thinned to murmurs. Men whispered near poker tables. Women gathered at the church steps, eyes cutting like knives. She noticed her milk deliveries stopped. Her firewood came late. One morning, she found her garden gate hacked in two. She fixed it. Said nothing. Just fed Boone and went about her work. But inside her chest, a slow, steady heat had begun to simmer. Tav had left, yes, but not far. She didn't know where he'd gone exactly. But she saw signs, a broken branch here, boot tracks by the arroyo, a pile of kindling neatly stacked by her fence when she hadn't been there to do it. Sometimes, she'd leave food out near the hollow tree and find a small handmade object in return, a woven charm, a rabbit's foot tied with twine, a polished stone. And once, an arrow carved with symbols she couldn't read. She ran her fingers over it that night by lamplight, tracing the grooves like she might understand something unspoken if she held it long enough. But the town wasn't silent forever. Marshall Reed rode up to her property one dry afternoon, dust kicking behind his horse like smoke. He was tall, all starch and suspicion, with a mustache he trimmed daily and a tin star that caught the light like a blade. "Miss Colton," he said, tipping his hat without warmth. "Marshall. Mind if I ask you a few questions? Would it matter if I did?" He dismounted slowly. "Someone's been stealing food out near the church shed. Couple folks saw a dark-skinned man near the east bluff. You know anything about that?" "No," she said flatly. "I don't keep track of shadows." The marshal nodded, slow. "Funny thing, though. Your fence gate looked busted. Thought maybe someone came through." She met his eyes. "Or someone went out." A pause stretched between them. Then Reed smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "You ever hear anything out there, widow? In the night? All I hear's the wind and my own damn thoughts." He laughed. "Right. Well, if you do hear anything else, you let me know. We're not looking for trouble. Just trying to keep peace." He rode off with the weight of a warning. Margaret watched him disappear into the heat haze, jaw tight. That night, Boone barked low near the porch. Margaret stepped outside, hand on her revolver, until she saw the shape emerge from the trees. Tav. His face looked sharper in the moonlight. thinner. Tired. He didn't speak. Just stood a few paces away, waiting. Margaret walked down the steps, heart tight in her throat. "You're risking your life," she said softly. He nodded. "They're watching. They know." Another nod. She looked at him. "Then why come back?" Tov reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased and torn, but still whole. He handed it to her. It was a flyer. The kind nailed to saloon walls and post offices. On it, a drawing of a man. Sharp features, dark eyes, high cheekbones. His face. $50, dead or alive, she read aloud. Tov's voice was low, the first time he'd spoken in weeks. "Alive is not how they hunt." She folded the paper, shoved it into her coat. "Stay the night," she said. "The barn's empty." He hesitated. "You sure?" "No," she said. "But I'm done being afraid of men who think law and justice are the same thing." He nodded. That night, he slept in the barn. She left food and water. At dawn, he was gone again. But the pattern returned. Every few days, he'd come. A flicker on the hilltop. A rustle of brush. A moment by the porch where neither of them said much, but both of them stayed a little longer than before. One afternoon, a storm rolled in sudden and loud. Thunder cracked across the hills like rifle fire. Rain slammed the dry earth, turning dust to mud in minutes. Margaret sat inside, fire lit, when Boone barked at the door. Tov stood there, soaked, shivering, eyes half closed. She stepped aside without a word. He collapsed in her kitchen. His shoulder was bleeding again, ripped open by something sharp. She cut away the soaked cloth, cleaned the wound, stitched him up as lightning lit the room in flashes. When she finished, she looked up and saw his gaze locked on hers. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, voice hoarse. Margaret didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "Because I know what it's like to be hunted by grief. By people. By silence." She brought him a blanket. That night, he slept inside. Boone curled near his feet, tail thumping once before sleep took him. And in the morning, something had shifted. Tov didn't leave right away. Instead, he helped her repair the barn roof. He chopped wood. Carved a new handle for her broken spade. He spoke little, but his hands worked steady, his eyes always watching, learning. Margaret found herself talking more, not about him, but about small things. The weather. Her garden. A time Wes once tried to teach her to ride bareback and she ended up in the creek. Tov chuckled at that. A deep, quiet sound. She didn't realize how much she missed laughter until that moment. Later that week, she showed him the broken locket he'd once returned to her. He held it carefully, like it was made of bone. "I found it after a skirmish," he said. "You were crying, near the canyon." She remembered. A month after Wes's funeral, she'd ridden out alone and dropped it without noticing. She never went back to look for it. Figured it was gone. "You followed me," she said. "I remembered your eyes." That night, they sat on the porch, side by side in the dark. No words. Just Boone's quiet breathing and the wind slipping through the cottonwoods. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel like she was holding herself together with threads. Something had started to mend. But neither of them knew how much time they had. Or what price the town would demand for something so fragile. Autumn in Ash Ridge came late, like a visitor who wasn't sure they were welcome. The leaves didn't change colors all at once. They turned slowly, reluctant gold clinging to stubborn green, as if the land itself resisted the idea of softness. But in the narrow stretch between the canyon walls, where Margaret kept a second, hidden cabin long abandoned by her father, autumn arrived gently. That's where she brought Tov after the third time his wounds reopened. The doctor in town wasn't an option. Neither was staying at her main property. There were too many eyes now. Too many whispers that came quicker than the wind. So they rode in silence, Boone trotting ahead, the old mule pulling a cart with what little they needed, food, blankets, herbs. Margaret guided them through paths only she knew, paths her father once taught her as a child, when he warned her, sometimes the world turns mean. That's when you need a place no one else can find. She'd never thought she'd use it for something like this. The cabin was modest. Just a single room, a stone hearth, and a narrow bed covered in dust. But the roof held, the chimney cleared, and the earth around it smelled of pine and memory. Tov didn't ask why she had it. She didn't explain. They spent the first day in silence, moving slowly, resting. She gathered herbs, boiled water, crushed bark for pain. He watched her hands like they held the answers to questions he hadn't dared ask in years. The second night, as rain tapped softly on the roof, he helped her fix the cracked window frame. She passed him nails. He passed her a smile. A small one, fleeting. But real. By the third day, something had changed. Tov began cooking. At first, it was simple, just roasted rabbit with wild onions. But then he started adding things she didn't recognize, crushed berries for sweetness, cedar ash for seasoning. He served without flourish, but his eyes flicked toward her every time she took a bite, waiting to see if she approved. She always did. In return, she began to speak. Not much. Just memories. Of Wes. Of the early years before the war came. Of the nights she used to watch lightning storms from this very porch with a wool blanket around her shoulders. Tov never interrupted. He just listened. She found herself wanting to fill the silence, not to chase it away, but to offer something back to him, the way he did with each quiet act of service. They repaired the roof together on the fourth day. Side by side on the beams, the sun warming their backs, the wind gentle for once. When Margaret slipped and scraped her hand, Tov caught her elbow quickly, not tightly, but firmly enough to steady her. Their eyes met. Neither of them smiled. But they didn't look away. That night, she noticed he'd placed her father's old blanket near her chair by the fire. Folded. Smoothed. Ready. She didn't ask. Just pulled it over her legs and nodded once. He nodded back. That was their language now, gestures. Eyes. Shared labor. The kind of closeness that doesn't need speaking. On the sixth night, she couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, rattling branches like bones. She stood by the window, watching the shadows shift across the ground, her thoughts loud in her skull. She didn't hear Tov approach until he stood beside her, arms folded, gaze out the window too. Storm's heading east, he said quietly. You can tell? He nodded. Sky smells different. She looked at him. You grew up in the mountains? He hesitated. High desert. Near the Salt River. She nodded, then paused. Do you miss it? Yes, he said simply. They stood in silence, watching the sky. Then, after a long pause, he added, but not tonight. It hit her in the chest like a slow ache. That strange feeling she hadn't allowed herself to name yet. Something dangerous. Something warm. She looked away before he could see it in her eyes. The next day, she found an old music box in the cabin's storage chest. Rusted, half broken, but when she wounded, the melody still played, soft and cracked like an old woman's laugh. She set it on the table that night. Tov listened, eyes closed, head tilted just slightly, as if the sound pulled him into a memory he hadn't touched in decades. After dinner, he took a small piece of wood from the pile and began carving. She didn't ask what it was. He didn't say. But each night after, she saw the shape taking form, small, delicate. A locket. Carved from pine. No hinges. Just a smooth, hollow piece with her initials burned into it with a hot nail. He left it on her pillow the night before he said he had to leave. They were sitting by the fire. Boone lay between them, half asleep, tail twitching in a dream. Tov stirred the embers once, then spoke. "I can't stay," he said. She didn't answer right away. "I know. If I stay, I'll bring danger to your door." Margaret nodded, staring at the flames. "It's already here." He looked at her. This time, it would be different. "I know that too." She met his gaze, and what passed between them in that moment wasn't desperation. It was knowing. This wasn't the end. But it had to be a pause. That night, she didn't sleep. When she rose at dawn, he was already gone. The cot was cold. The door was closed. No note. But there, on the porch rail, sat a single hawk feather tied with her old scarf, clean, folded, untouched by dust. She picked it up, pressed it to her lips, and closed her eyes. He hadn't left out of fear. He'd left out of love.
It started with hoofbeats. Distant, muffled by dust and dry wind. But Margaret knew that rhythm. Riders. Too many for a friendly visit. Too fast for a patrol. She set down her canteen and wiped her hands on her apron. The well creaked behind her. Boone barked once, then fell quiet. He knew too. The riders came up the ridge fast. 6 men. All of them local. She recognized Amos Graves, the banker's son who'd always looked at her with a mix of reverence and pity since Wes died. Behind him, Deputy Lee, jaw tight, hand near his holster. They didn't speak until they dismounted. "Mrs. Caro," Amos said, not tipping his hat. "We need a word." She kept her voice even. "What's the matter?" Lee stepped forward. "Got word there was an Apache seen not 2 miles from here. Woman said he was wounded. Riding west. Someone helped him." Margaret's eyes didn't flinch. "And folks say you've been keeping to yourself. Supplies going missing from your barn. A horse taken from the stable, then returned. Mule gone a week." Amos crossed his arms. "This a good time to check your property?" She nodded once. "Go ahead." They searched the house, the barn, even the root cellar. They found nothing, of course they wouldn't. Tov had been gone 2 weeks. But they stayed long enough to make sure their suspicion soaked into every beam of the house. As they turned to leave, Amos hesitated on the porch. "You were a good woman, Margaret." "Everyone says so." "I still am," she replied. His face tightened. "Let's hope that stays true." The threat wasn't in the words. It was in the fact he said them at all. By evening, she was alone again, but the house no longer felt like hers. The town had turned. She could feel it in the silence at the general store, the way people stepped just slightly aside when she passed. She had done nothing illegal. Nothing unholy. But that didn't matter in Ash Ridge. Not if folks thought you had. They didn't need proof. They needed a reason. And she'd given them one. The next morning, he came back. Tov appeared like he always had, quiet, sudden, part of the landscape. She was chopping wood behind the shed when he stepped out of the trees. "Margaret," he said, simply. She didn't smile. Didn't run. "Why?" she asked. "They're hunting me," he said. "I know. But I couldn't stay gone." She looked at him hard. "You said leaving was to keep me safe." "It was." "And now?" He stepped closer. "Now I don't care." The silence between them was heavy. Then she shook her head, not in anger, but in awe of her own heart. "You fool," she whispered. "You came back for me." He said nothing. Just opened his hand. In his palm was a smooth stone. Obsidian. The kind used for blades, or amulets. On it, a symbol burned into the surface. Apache for home. "I have no tribe left," he said. "No land. But I remember what my grandfather said, home is not place. Home is the soul that sees you and stays." She took the stone. Then, from the trees, rifles cocked. They'd been followed. Voices erupted. Hands in the air. "Step away from him, Margaret." The sheriff's men had come without warning. Some townsfolk too. Amos, of course, at the front. Pale, sweating, eyes gleaming with the thrill of righteous purpose. Tov didn't reach for anything. He didn't move. Margaret stepped between him and the rifles. "Don't," she said. "He's unarmed." "You aiding a fugitive?" Deputy Lee asked. She didn't answer. "Step aside, Margaret," he warned. "We don't want to do this in front of you." She didn't move. Amos spat on the ground. "You gonna throw away your whole life for him?" Her jaw tightened. "I already did. And I'd do it again." Tov touched her arm gently, then stepped forward with hands raised. "No more blood," he said. "Not for me." But Margaret was done begging. This man nursed a fox with a broken leg. He knows how to boil wild onions without losing the sweetness. He listens when I talk about things no one else remembers. And he saved me from the worst of my own grief when no one else even tried. She turned to Amos. "Tell me that's not worth protecting." Amos flinched, but Lee didn't. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Law's the law." The chains went around Tov's wrists. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. But when they led him away, his eyes never left hers. They tried her next. Not in court, but in whispers. The church stopped visiting. A woman at the mill asked if she was still confused. Someone painted "Squaw Lover" on her barn door. She washed it off with a bucket of rainwater and didn't say a word. What could she say? He was gone. She didn't know where they took him. The jail claimed he'd been transferred. No one would tell her where. Not even Lee, who avoided her eyes at every turn. And so, for days, she returned to the old cabin. Boone followed her like a shadow. She swept the porch. Boiled stew. Sat by the fire with the music box. And waited. Because love, real love, the kind not built on words but on acts of quiet defiance, does not break when the world turns cruel. It burrows Indiana. It endures. Even when it's silent. Even when it's caged. It was nearly winter when she got the letter. Folded in a cracked envelope, barely legible. No return address. No name. But she knew the handwriting. "I am alive." 3 words. She held it to her chest as if the warmth of her heart could pull him through it all. Tav wasn't dead. He wasn't gone. But the rest of the message was vague, only a hint: head east of the canyon where the sycamores bend. I'll be waiting. She read it 5 times before packing a satchel and saddling her horse. No one in town said goodbye. The land east of the canyon was bare and brittle. Wind carved long sighs through the trees. Boone padded quietly beside her, his ears always turning, alert for sound. For 2 days, she searched. Made camp under stars. Called out only once. Tav. Then silence. On the 3rd morning, she found him. He was thinner. A scar traced his collarbone. But his eyes were the same. Steady. Wild. Soft. They didn't speak at first. They just stood there, the sun rising behind them, until Boone rushed forward and nuzzled Tav's hand like a child who remembered an old friend. Margaret finally broke the silence. They said you'd been transferred. But no one would say where. Tav nodded. Fort Carlton. Then, nowhere. The soldier who brought me food was half mescalero. Said he didn't like the look in the warden's eyes. Helped me slip away during a dust storm. And now? She asked. I have no place left to run. Only forward. With you, if you'll still have me. She stepped to him, took his hand. I never let you go. They built a new life between 2 rivers. Far enough from Ash Ridge that no one whispered. Close enough to trade when needed. They built a small home with their hands and patience. Stone by stone. Day by day. She planted herbs. He hunted, but only what they needed. And every Sunday, when the sun hit the edge of the horizon, they'd light the small fire pit outside the cabin and sit side by side. Boone at their feet. The music box on the table. Playing the tune that had once echoed in silence, now echoing in peace. Letters arrived sometimes. From Miss Clara, in careful script, they still talk about you. The barn was painted over, but folks remember. Some in shame. Some in awe. From Deputy Lee, you were right to stand by him. We all saw it. Just took the rest of us too long to admit it. Even Amos wrote, years later, my father called it betrayal. I call it bravery. You loved where no one else dared. In spring, the apple trees they planted bloomed white as snow. A sign, she said, of clean beginnings. Tav carved toys for children in nearby villages. Margaret taught women how to distill oils from wildflowers. Sometimes, other couples came through. A Mexican man and a half-Navajo wife. A white preacher with a Cheyenne girl he'd married against his own father's will. They all found refuge here. Love had made its home in the wilderness. One night, Margaret sat by the fire, her hair silver in the firelight, Tav's hand in hers. Do you ever miss the tribe? She asked. He stared into the embers. Every day. But some tribes are chosen. Not born. She smiled softly. Then let this be ours. He looked at her then, with that slow, reverent gaze, the one that had never changed, not even in chains. It always was. Emotional takeaway for the viewer. In a world divided by fear and blood, 2 souls chose kindness. Compassion. A love that defied borders and judgment. Their story wasn't about survival alone, it was about building something no one else believed possible: peace. Between a white widow and a hunted Apache warrior. Love didn't just bloom. It endured. It healed. And it won.
If this story moved you, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in second chances. More Wild West tales of love, loss, and redemption coming next week. Tell us in the comments, would you have helped the warrior or turned him in?